Russia is bleeding out in front of a village it cannot name without flinching, not metaphorically, literally. As I record this, more than 1,500 consecutive days of Russian assault have shattered against a 100-house settlement in southern Zaporizhia called Malotokmachka. 1,500 days. That is longer than the siege of Carthage. That is longer than Leningrad. That is longer than Stalingrad and Sevastopol combined. And the Russian army, with its tanks, its mine trawls, its motorized rifle regiments, its glide bombs, and its televised promises of imminent breakthrough, has not been able to walk into a village of roughly 100 standing structures, none of which are even intact anymore. This is not a story about a village. This is a case study in the structural failure of an army that still believes mass can substitute for doctrine. What you are witnessing at Malotokmachka is not a localized stalemate. It is the visible bottom of a much larger collapse, the moment when Russian offensive doctrine, Russian command culture, and Russian industrial replacement rates all fail in the same square kilometer, in front of the same defenders, against the same brigade for the fourth consecutive year. Let me say this plainly because there will be no hedging in what follows. The Russian army that crossed the border in February 2022 has effectively been bled out of existence in places like this. What is being fed forward today is not the army Putin started the war with. It is a replacement army. And the replacement army has discovered in front of Malotokmachka that the Ukrainian defense is no longer a line on a map. It is a kill architecture. And what happens next changes everything. Now pull the lens back. Rewind 4 years. In the spring of 2022, when Russian forces seized the southern shoulder of Zaporizhia, the assumption inside Russian General Staff planning was almost embarrassingly confident. Malotokmachka sits east of Orekhiv, north of the occupied railway junction at Tokmak, and within striking distance of the highway lattice that Russia uses to push pressure toward Zaporizhia city. On a map, it is a forward speed bump. On Russian doctrine, it should have fallen in days. The village had no garrison fortress, no historical defensive infrastructure, and a pre-war population of around 3,000 civilians. The Russian theory of victory in southern Ukraine assumed that any settlement of this size, this close to the line of contact, would collapse under the weight of combined arms pressure within a single campaign season. That assumption was not a tactical miscalculation. It was a doctrinal one. And here is the part the mainstream framing keeps missing. The Western press has spent 2 years describing Malotokmachka as a curiosity, a meme, a tiny dot that keeps appearing in Russian state television announcements of imminent capture. Russian state media Chamli and Washington Channel 1, the program Bolshaya Igra, has literally reported the same sentence month after month for an entire year. The Russian army is advancing in the Zaporizhia region near the village of Malotokmachka, the exact same line, the exact same expert, the exact same lie. But this is not a media story. The reason that sentence keeps repeating on Russian television is because the Russian army cannot stop trying. And the reason it cannot stop trying is because the Russian theory of war requires that it succeed. If a 100-house village in Zaporizhia can hold for 1,500 days against a continental army, then the entire Russian narrative of inevitable territorial accumulation collapses. So they send another wave and another and another, and the village holds. Let me walk you through what this actually means at the strategic level. The defense of Malotokmachka has been carried primarily and with extraordinary continuity by the 118th Separate Mechanized Brigade of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, and Kerch Bridge. This brigade has now been formally entered into the Book of Records of Ukraine for the longest continuous defense of a single populated point in the modern Russian-Ukrainian war. 1,500 consecutive days holding the same position. There is no Western military equivalent in living memory. The Marines at Khe-San held for 77 days. The British at Tobruk held for 240. The defenders of Bastogne held for roughly a week before relief. Malotokmachka has now held under continuous assault for a duration that exceeds all of them stacked end to end multiple times over. And it has held against an enemy that is not running out of bodies, that is critical to understand, but is running out of usable bodies. According to Ukrainian General Staff figures cross-referenced by independent monitoring, Russia lost more soldiers killed and wounded in the first quarter of 2026 than the Kremlin was able to recruit in the same period. Read that sentence again. The Russian replacement rate has gone negative. The army is now shrinking under its own offensive tempo, and the place where that shrinkage is most visible, most documented, and most operationally embarrassing is Mala Tokmachka. This is the hidden variable that mainstream coverage refuses to engage with. The Russian army is not failing because Ukraine is stronger in absolute terms. It is failing because Russian offensive doctrine, frontal mechanized assault supported by glide bomb saturation and artillery, was designed for an opponent that does not exist anymore. The opponent it was designed for was a Ukrainian army of 2022. The opponent it is actually fighting is a Ukrainian army that has spent 4 years building a layered, drone-saturated, sensor-integrated, mine-dense, electronic warfare-hardened kill zone in front of every village it intends to keep. And it gets even more serious from here. Let me take you through the chronology because the chronology is the verdict. In June 2023, during the Ukrainian summer counteroffensive, Mala Tokmachka was one of the staging villages from which the 47th Mechanized Brigade and other formations pushed south toward Robotine. And that offensive did not achieve the operational breakthrough Western capitals hoped for, and the political consequences of that disappointment have shaped every aid debate since. But what almost no one in Western commentary captured at the time was the second-order effect. Mala Tokmachka, by becoming a Ukrainian forward edge in 2023, also became a Russian obsession. From that moment forward, the village stopped being a village. It became a fixation point, a piece of map real estate that Russian commanders had to take to validate the broader campaign narrative. By 2024, Russian assault tempo in the Orikhiv direction had shifted from operational maneuver to attritional saturation. Company size and battalion size assaults began arriving in waves, mechanized columns supported by mine trawl tanks. Infantry pushed forward on motorcycles and quad bikes, and free or kindasti and free and a doctrine the Russians borrowed from their own failures, attempting to reduce the signature mass that Ukrainian drones could engage. It did not work. The 118th Brigade responded with pre-laid minefields, FPV drone teams hunting in pairs, artillery integrated through real-time targeting feeds, and reserve drone interdiction at depth. In August 2025, a Russian armored column attempted to break through on the road, separating occupied Novopokrovka from Mala Tokmachka. The first tank in the column was a mine trawl variant, designed specifically to clear the Ukrainian engineering barriers that had stopped every previous attempt. It was stopped by those barriers anyway. The second tank was destroyed by coordinated drone and anti-tank fire. Russian infantry attempted to dismount and infiltrate through the tree line to escape Ukrainian drones. They were hunted down. The final ledger from that single engagement, confirmed by the 118th Brigade, 2 tanks destroyed, 5 infantry fighting vehicles destroyed, 4 motorcycles destroyed, 1 Tiger armored vehicle destroyed, 22 Russians confirmed killed, 14 wounded. And there in Landbridge, in year and Furin hours alone. That was one assault. One day, one road. In October 2025, Russia escalated again in what is now considered one of the largest assault waves of the entire Mala Tokmachka campaign. Russian forces deployed up to 26 pieces of mechanized equipment, including tanks, in multiple coordinated waves. Ukrainian defenders, again the 118th Brigade, again from the same positions, repelled the assault and destroyed the equipment using pre-laid mines and FPV drone strikes. Mala Tokmachka remained under Ukrainian control, not partially, not contested, controlled. Now pull the lens back further because this is where the case study becomes a doctrine. The real question is not whether Russia takes Mala Tokmachka. The real question is what Mala Tokmachka tells us about the structural condition of the Russian armed forces in 2026, and the answer is brutal. Russia has, in front of this single village, expended an estimated 2,000 killed and wounded, and that is conservative, drawn from unconfirmed but consistent battlefield reporting. They have lost dozens of armored vehicles. They have burned through multiple battalions of mechanized infantry. They have committed elite assault detachments. They have used glide bombs in the hundreds, and they have advanced nothing of strategic value. Compare that to what Ukraine has built around the same village. The defense of Malotokmachka is now operationally a showcase of what Ukrainian planners call the layered kill architecture. Layer 1, deep strike. Ukraine's middle strike doctrine, Durkwenstein Spiam and were Ekreprentrepeshkinsti and Orftrainstein drones with ranges up to 200 kilometers, is currently dismantling Russian rear area logistics that support every assault toward Zaporizhia. Ammunition depots burning, fuel depots burning, repair facilities burning. Russian supply runs forced into longer, slower routes that bleed time and tempo out of every assault wave before it even reaches the front. Layer 2, medium-range interdiction. Ukrainian artillery and longer-range FPV systems are killing Russian assault columns before they reach the line of departure. Layer 3, tactical drone saturation. FPV teams hunt in pairs and triples with overlapping fields of view integrated with infantry observation and artillery cueing. Layer 4, engineering depth. Mines, dragon's teeth, anti-tank ditches, or the kind of defensive engineering Russian doctrine was supposed to render obsolete with mass. The result is a kill funnel. Russian columns enter the funnel closes. The columns do not exit. And here is the doctrinal verdict, because we cannot leave it implicit. The Russian army is fighting a 2022 war against a 2026 enemy. That is the entire story compressed into one sentence. Every assault wave at Malotokmachka assumes that Ukrainian defenses can be saturated by mass. Every assault wave discovers that Ukrainian defenses no longer scale linearly with mass. They scale logarithmically. The more mass Russia commits, the more visible the column becomes to drone reconnaissance. The faster the interdiction window opens, the more efficient the kill chain executes. Russian doctrine is now actively making the Russian army easier to kill. Now let me pull this up another level, because the strategic consequences are even larger than the battlefield ones. Malotokmachka is the small visible symptom of a state-level industrial and demographic failure inside the Russian Federation. Consider what the Kremlin has spent to not capture this village. Tank production at Uralvagon-Zavod, the only Russian facility producing new main battle tanks at any meaningful rate, is currently estimated at fewer than 300 new tanks per year, and most of what is reaching the front is refurbished Soviet-era stock from storage depots. Those storage depots, once estimated at well over 10,000 tanks, are now visibly depleted in satellite imagery. The Russian army has, over the course of this war, lost armored equipment at roughly 3 to 4 times its sustainable replacement rate. Wakshki and Dakshi Wanshi. The mathematics are no longer recoverable on any peacetime timeline. Recruitment is in a similar collapse. The Kremlin has avoided a second wave of formal mobilization since 2022 because the political cost is unbearable. Instead, recruitment has been pushed onto cash bonuses, regional quotas, prison conscription, and increasingly on foreign nationals, North Koreans, Central Asian migrants, Cubans. The quality of the assault infantry being thrown at villages like Malotokmachka has declined in lockstep. This is why we are seeing motorcycle assaults, ATV charges, and small group infiltration attempts replacing combined arms maneuver. It is not innovation. It is desperation dressed as doctrine, and it gets even more serious from here, because the political problem Putin now faces is no longer how to win. It is how to explain why he cannot win. Russian state television cannot show 1,500 days of failure, so it shows the same sentence on repeat. The Russian army is advancing near Malotokmachka. The Russian army is advancing near Malotokmachka. The Russian army is advancing near Malotokmachka. 12 months. Same sentence. Same expert. Same village. Same lie. That is not propaganda strength. That is propaganda exhaustion. Now let me take you to the climactic operation, because there is one and it matters. In late spring of 2026, as part of the broader Ukrainian counterpressure across the southern front, Ukrainian forces around Malotokmachka shifted from pure defense to active interdiction. The 118th Brigade, supported by drone strike groups operating against the Russian rear, executed what Ukrainian operational language describes as a forward-bleeding posture. Rather than waiting for Russian assault columns to arrive at the village edge, Ukrainian forces began engaging them at the line of departure. At the moment of forming up before the assault even began, Russian columns were being killed in their assembly areas. Russian command posts were being struck in the rear. Russian artillery batteries supporting the Molotov-Machka axis were being hunted by long-range drones operating against their counter-battery radars. The effect was immediate and verifiable. The Ukrainian spokesperson for the volunteer army, Serhiy Bratchuk, has publicly stated that while Molotov-Machka remains one of the most difficult directions on the front, the number of attacks has measurably decreased. That decrease is not because Russia gave up. It is because Russia ran out of usable assault formations in that sector. The wells are dry. The columns are not arriving because the columns no longer exist. And in May 2026, the verdict was made official. The 118th Separate Mechanized Brigade was formally entered into the Book of Records of Ukraine for defending Molotov-Machka for more than 1,500 days. That is not a ceremonial gesture. That is a strategic communications act. Ukraine is telling the world in the most concrete way possible that the Russian theory of inevitable territorial accumulation has failed in front of a 100-house village. Pull the lens back one final time because the larger pattern is now visible. Molotov-Machka is not unique. It is representative. The same dynamic is repeating across the entire southern and eastern front. Russian forces are committing mass to take terrain. The terrain refuses to fall. The mass is consumed, and the next wave arrives smaller, less trained, less equipped, and less likely to break through. The kill architecture Ukraine has built around Molotov-Machka is being replicated around Orikhiv, around Huliaipol, around Pokrovsk, around Kupiansk. The architecture is portable. The doctrine is teachable. The drone supply chain is industrial. The Ukrainian advantage is no longer ad hoc improvisation. It is a system. And the system is what Putin's army has actually lost to, not a village, not a brigade. A system that learns faster than Russian doctrine can adapt. The broader lesson here, the one history will record, is the lesson of every great power that mistook scale for capability. The French at Dien Bien Phu thought mass would substitute for terrain awareness. The Soviets in Afghanistan thought firepower would substitute for political legitimacy. The Americans in Iraq thought technological dominance would substitute for cultural literacy. Russia at Molotov-Machka has discovered the modern version of the same mistake. They believe that mechanized mass, supported by glide bombs and Soviet-era doctrine, would substitute for the integrated sensor-shooter loop the modern battlefield now demands. It does not. It cannot. And the price of discovering that in front of one village has been roughly 2,000 casualties, dozens of armored vehicles, and the visible exhaustion of an entire propaganda apparatus. So where does this leave us? Putin's army has not literally vanished, and I will not insult your intelligence by pretending it has. But the army that began this war is gone. What is fighting in Zaporizhia today is a replacement formation, fed forward into a kill architecture it cannot defeat, supported by an industrial base that cannot replace its losses, commanded by a doctrine that cannot adapt to drone-saturated battle space, and narrated by a media apparatus that has run out of new sentences. The vanishing is not in the present tense. It is in the trend line. And the trend line is now beyond recovery on any timeline Putin can politically survive. The question that remains is not whether Russia can take Molotov-Machka. It cannot. The question is what happens to the regime when the country it has been promised victory in for 4 years quietly understands that the army doing the fighting is not the army that left. That is the open question. That is the unresolved variable. And that is the question we will be returning to in the coming weeks, because the signals coming out of Russian recruitment, Russian industrial output, and Russian rear area logistics are about to converge in ways that the Kremlin cannot manage with a single sentence on Channel 1. History will record that the moment the Russian army stopped being a serious offensive force was not announced. It was discovered. Discovered in the burned holes of mine trawl tanks on a road that does not lead anywhere strategic. Discovered in the silence of an assembly area that no column ever formed in. Discovered in the patience of a brigade that held a village for 1,500 days because the alternative was unthinkable. If you want to follow this story as it develops, and it is developing faster than mainstream coverage is admitting, make sure you are subscribed to this channel. We are pushing toward a goal that lets us deliver this analysis daily with the depth this war actually requires, and your subscription is the single thing that makes that possible. Hit subscribe. Stay with us, because the questions Molotov-Machka has just answered are about to open much larger questions across the entire Russian front, and those questions do not have simple answers. I will see you in the next analysis.